The garage had a particular smell that belonged only to itself, a combination of oil and metal and the dust that accumulated in corners, despite any effort to keep the space clean. It was a smell that announced itself the moment you pushed open the heavy wooden door, a smell that mixed with the cooler air of the early morning before the sun had fully heated the day. This smell became, over time, the smell of Saturday mornings, of learning, of a man teaching without words what his hands had learned through decades of work. My uncle's garage was not large, and it was not organized in any way that anyone else would have recognized as organized. Tools hung on walls in no apparent order. Parts and materials were stored in boxes and cans that had been repurposed from other things. The workbench, built by my uncle himself years before I was born, was covered with the marks of years of work, dents and stains and scratches that recorded the history of things that had been fixed or created there. But within this apparent chaos was a logic that my uncle understood completely, a geography that his hands knew without his mind having to think about it. I was maybe 8 or 9 years old the first time he took me into the garage with the intention of teaching me something, not just letting me come along while he worked, which had happened before, but actually showing me how to do something. He needed to change the oil in his truck, and he explained each step as he did it, letting me hand him tools, showing me how to tell when the oil had drained completely, letting me help pour the new oil into the engine. What I remember is not the particular steps of the process, but the way his hands moved, the way he knew without looking where things were, the way he could explain something while simultaneously doing it, his mind divided between instruction and work without either one suffering. He did not talk much while we worked. The conversation was minimal and mostly practical, but there was a kind of communication happening that did not depend on words, that happened through the work itself, through his showing me where to stand, how to hold something, when to hand him the next tool. The tools themselves were objects of attention. He had certain tools that he used regularly, and they were kept sharp and clean and in good repair. He had other tools that he used less often, and these were kept in drawers and boxes, organized according to a system that made sense to him. He would show me a tool and explain what it was for, would show me how to hold it, would sometimes let me try to use it under his supervision. The tools had weight and substance. They were not toys. They were instruments of serious work, and they were to be treated with respect. The garage became a place where I wanted to be, where Saturday mornings or afternoon hours meant going to my uncle's garage, meant the smell of oil and the sound of work, meant learning something. My uncle had never finished high school. He had apprenticed with the mechanic as a young man, and he had spent his entire adult life working with cars, fixing what was broken, maintaining what needed to be maintained. He did not talk about education in formal terms, but he was teaching me in the language of tools and work, something that no classroom could teach. There was a particular respect in the way my uncle moved through his work. He did things carefully. He did not rush. If something was not going the way it was supposed to go, he would stop and think about it, would try a different approach, would not force things. He would say, in the few words he used, things like, "You got to know when to push and when to let it tell you what it needs." This was advice that seemed to be about mechanics, but was actually about something larger, something about how to move through the world. The other men who came to the garage, and there were several, men who brought their cars for my uncle to work on, men who seemed to come as much for the company and the conversation as for the actual work. They treated the garage as a kind of gathering place. They would sit on stools around the workbench or lean against the walls, and they would talk while my uncle worked. The conversation ranged over many topics, but it was not hurried conversation. People would say something and then be silent for a while, and the silence was not awkward. It was just time being filled with work and presence. What I understand now is that my uncle was creating a space where a particular kind of masculinity was lived out and transmitted. It was a masculinity that was built on competence, on the ability to make and fix things, on self-sufficiency, on the dignity of work. It was not aggressive or harsh. There was no performance of toughness. There was simply the quiet authority of someone who knew what he was doing and did it well. The garage had a radio, an old thing that picked up mostly AM stations. There would be music interrupted by static and by advertisements. Sometimes my uncle would listen to talk radio, to sports broadcasts, to the news. The radio was background, a constant low presence that I did not think much about at the time, but that created the soundscape of those Saturday mornings. One day, when I was maybe 10 or 11, my uncle asked me to help him with a job that was more complicated than the simple oil changes or filter replacements I had helped with before. A man had brought a car that was not running right, that had some problem that needed diagnosis. My uncle spent a long time listening to the engine, asking the owner questions about what had happened, what the car had been doing. Then he began to work, methodically checking different things, eliminating possibilities, narrowing down where the problem might be. He let me help, not in a way that got in his way, but in a way that let me be part of the investigation. He explained what he was looking for, why he was checking certain things. He showed me how to listen to an engine, how to tell from the sound whether something was wrong. He showed me that fixing something required not just knowing what to do, but thinking about what could be wrong, that the mind had to work as much as the hands. When he found the problem, a faulty spark plug wire that was causing a misfire, he showed me what the problem was, explained why it caused the symptoms the owner had described, showed me how to replace it. The satisfaction when the engine ran correctly again was not just his satisfaction, but something that extended to me as well. We had solved the problem together, or rather, he had solved it while I had been part of the solving. My uncle never told me that I should do this work, never said that I should become a mechanic, never presented the garage as a career path that I should follow, but he was showing me that this work had value, that it was respectable, that it was worth learning to do well. He was showing me that a person could survive and provide for themselves through the quality of their work, through the reputation they built, through the trust that people placed in their competence. The garage was also a place where I learned about failure and mistakes. My uncle made mistakes. I would see him realize that he had done something wrong, that he needed to undo his work and do it again. He did not get angry at himself. He simply corrected the error and moved on. He would sometimes explain to me what had gone wrong, what he should have done instead, what he would do next time. These lessons about failure were as important as the lessons about success. There was also the matter of money, though this was never discussed directly. I understood that my uncle charged people for his work, that this was how he made his living, that the quality of his work determined how much people would pay him and whether they would bring their cars to him again. I understood that he had built a reputation over years, that people trusted him, that they came back to him because they knew he would do good work and charge them fairly. The garage was also a place where I learned about class and about the limits of respect and safety. Some of the people who came with cars were wealthier than my uncle. They drove better cars, wore nicer clothes, seemed to come from different worlds. But in the garage, they were dependent on my uncle's knowledge and skill. They had to accept his judgment about what was wrong with their cars, had to trust that he would charge them fairly. The power dynamic was shifted in a way that seemed to understand something about what skill and knowledge meant. There was a particular man, a white man in a suit, who brought his expensive car to my uncle one day when I was there. The man seemed impatient, seemed to think that the problem should be fixed immediately, seemed not to understand that these things took time. My uncle was polite, but did not hurry. He did the work at his own pace, explained what he was doing without being asked to explain, charged what the work was worth. The man paid and left, seeming somewhat dissatisfied with the time it had taken. My uncle did not seem to care about the man's dissatisfaction. He had done the work correctly, and that was what mattered. I began to understand, through watching my uncle work with different people, something about dignity as something that was maintained through your own standards, through your refusal to compromise on quality, through your knowledge that what you did mattered. My uncle did not need anyone else's approval to know that his work was good. He knew it himself. As I got older, I spent less time in the garage. School took up more time. Other interests occupied me. I was becoming a teenager, and the things that had seemed exciting at age 9 seemed less interesting at age 14. But I still went to the garage sometimes, still helped my uncle with projects, still watched him work. What I did not understand at the time was how much I was learning, not just about cars and tools, but about what it meant to be a man who worked with his hands, about what self-respect meant, about what pride in work meant. I did not understand that my uncle was giving me something that many children did not have, the example of an adult man who was competent, who was respected, who did not need to prove his masculinity through aggression or performance because it was evident in the quality of his work. There was a period, I think in my late teens, when I was ashamed of my uncle's work. I was in school learning about different kinds of success, different kinds of status. A mechanic seemed to occupy a lower rung in the hierarchy of work that I was being taught. I did not say anything to my uncle about this, but I think he knew the way adults know these things about young people. He did not try to convince me that his work was important. He simply continued to do it, continued to do it well, continued to be who he was. Looking back now, I understand that shame for what it was, a failure of imagination, a failure to understand that the hierarchy I was being taught did not reflect the reality of what my uncle did or who he was. I understand now that the work he did required intelligence, problem-solving ability, the ability to think systematically, the ability to work with precision. I understand that his lack of formal education did not mean he was not educated. He was educated in the school of work, and that education was real and valuable. My uncle died when I was in my 20s, before I had fully come to understand the value of what he had been teaching me. I had left for college, had gone in a different direction, had adopted the values of the school system without ever fully examining whether they made sense. But by the time he died, I was beginning to understand what I had lost, or rather, what I had been given and had not yet learned to value. The garage is gone now. The space was sold, converted into something else. The tools were distributed among family members or sold. The radio is gone. The workbench, that beautiful structure that my uncle had built, is gone. But the memory of it remains, and the memory carries within it the lessons that were never explicitly taught, but were lived in that space, in the sound of tools, in the smell of oil, in the patience with which my uncle worked. What I understand now is that my uncle was teaching me through his example something about how to live with dignity, how to do work that mattered, how to know your own competence and not need anyone else to validate it. He was teaching me that there were many ways to be educated, that formal schooling was not the only path to knowledge and competence. He was teaching me that a person could be respected and self-sufficient without needing to adopt the values of people who came from different backgrounds or had different kinds of work. I think about the men and boys now who do not have access to that kind of teaching, who do not have an uncle or a grandfather or a father figure who can show them how to work, how to fix things, how to move through the world with competence and quiet dignity. I think about how much has been lost in the shift away from these kinds of apprenticeships, these kinds of relationships between an older man and a younger one, where knowledge is transmitted, not through instruction, but through presence and example. I also think about the particular moment in time when my uncle was doing this work, the 1970s and 1980s, when his kind of knowledge was still being valued, when there were still cars that people could work on with basic tools, when there was still a market for the kind of work he did. The world has changed since then. Cars have become more complicated. The economy has shifted. The way people learn has changed. But the garage remains in memory as a space where something important happened, where a kind of knowledge was transmitted, where a boy learned what it meant to be a man through the example of his uncle's hands and the quality of his work. The smell of oil, when I encounter it now, brings all of this back with a clarity that is almost physical. It brings back the Saturday mornings, the sound of tools, the sight of my uncle's hands working, the particular quality of his presence and his patience. It brings back the understanding, learned without words, that work mattered, that quality mattered, that a person's competence and the reputation they built through that competence was real and valuable and respectable. I did not become a mechanic. My life took different paths. But I carry with me the lessons from those Saturday mornings in the garage. I carry the understanding that work done well is its own reward, that dignity comes from within and is maintained through your own standards, that there are many kinds of education and knowledge. I carry the understanding that my uncle was a teacher, teaching in the way that made sense in his context with the tools and knowledge he had, showing a young person what it meant to be a man who could fix things, who could solve problems, who could be depended upon. That teaching transmitted through presence and example, through the patient work of showing rather than telling, remains with me. It remains as a kind of template for what it means to care about work, to take pride in work, to understand that the quality of what you do says something about who you are. It remains as a memory of a man who did not need anyone else's validation to know that what he did was important and valuable. And it remains as a gift that I did not fully understand I was receiving at the time, but that has become more precious as time has passed, and I have come to understand what was being transmitted in that garage, Saturday after Saturday, year after year.